number. Tell us why. For anyone that you're seeing. Oh, oops. Wrong one.
And just to sort of manage the conversation, guys, just to say welcome everyone to the today's Cultivating Personal Resilience webinar. I can see that there are at least 40 people on board, some through the phone.
Is now joining.
And some through their computers. So welcome and good morning, everybody, from all of us at Northwest Employers. Just a quick introduction to Matt. Matt's been one of our associates as long as I can remember, Matt. And we've been doing quite a bit of work with Matt on personal resilience. Matt's been doing some training for our counsellors on it. And we are in the process
now joining.
Working with technology to essentially deliver this Cultivating Personal Resilience webinar with you all. The theme actually interestingly came out of the weekly HR webinar that Andrew and Keith have been running over the last couple of weeks, and our next one will be happening next week, for those of you that want to know when the next one is. So Matt, without further ado, and I think just to sort of help, my role today is to sort of help facilitate the discussion, and in terms of rules of the house, if you like, if you could please kindly mute your mics, because otherwise we'll all hear everyone's background music and not hear Matt. And I'm wondering, and some people are already doing this, if you could tell us how you're feeling via the chat, that would be phenomenal. So without further ado, Matt, over to you, and I will interject as we see fit.
Yeah, just interrupt me as I go. Yeah, sounds good. Good stuff. Morning, everyone. Great to have you all here this morning. I'm really pleased with how many people have logged in. That's either a good sign or a bad sign that so many people want to learn about resilience. That, you know, you could probably read that either way, but we'll see. We'll see as we go through. So yeah, you've said in terms of my background, I'm a business psychologist. Work with loads of different types of organisations, so I do a lot of work with Northwest Employers, but a lot in the public sector, but also the private sector, all over really. And it sounds really corny at the start of a session like this, but the one thing that connects the people that I work, the organisations that I work with, regardless of where they are people. And my firm belief that if people are healthy and happy at work, then it has a real positive impact on them and their organisation. So obviously, today's session is a little bit different from some of the sessions that I generally run. So always the sessions that I run are kind of focused on well-being and resilience and psychology and that side of things. But obviously, with what's going on at the moment, I wanted to do a little bit more in terms of understanding the potential impact of something like a pandemic. You know, something like the upheaval and the disruption that we're currently seeing. We'll see in a second that it's difficult. I think it's pretty unprecedented what we're facing at the moment, but there are some lessons that we can take from some of the research around this. And then I just wanted to go a little bit more into how that impacts people in terms of how it leads to different levels of stress, what triggers that, but more importantly, what people can do from a resilience perspective to build that up to hopefully deal with some of those stresses, some of those pressures in a bit more of a positive way, if that makes sense. So thanks for everyone who's been telling us how they're feeling today. Let's jump into some of the content and go through. So like I say, looking for parallels, I'll be honest, it was difficult. There's not much that's, you know, kind of completely comparable to what we're currently seeing, just the scale really of the disruption and of the lives lost as well, to be perfectly honest, that we're currently seeing with coronavirus. But there are a number of different kind of macro level events and disasters that have happened in the past that allow us to look for lessons and look for kind of ideas in terms of what's the psychological impact of some of this. So there's a lot in the news and in the media about obviously the health impact, the direct health impact. We're looking at the financial impact, that side of things. But what's the impact in terms of people who are still working, people who are out of work, you know, psychologically, how they're thinking, how they're feeling, and how they're behaving as well. So there's a number of different ones here. So right back to the 1918 to 20, the Spanish flu, which is suddenly getting a lot more media than I think it ever has done before. That's because it's the last true global pandemic that we've seen on this sort of scale. To be perfectly honest, again, probably slightly larger scale in the sense that killed kind of, you know, up to 100 million people. So real serious event way back then. And the mortality rate was similar. It was quite high. But there were differences back then. The main one being the media. So actually, at the time, obviously there was no social media, so that it wasn't as constant as we're seeing today. And the mainstream media at the time, they were actually trying to downplay it because number one, they didn't want to cause panic amongst people. But the other thing was it was slap bang in the middle of the First World War, so countries didn't want to show weakness. So actually, the media were doing, to a certain extent, kind of everything they could to downplay it. So it wasn't so much perhaps in the psyches of the people that were living during the time, even though the death toll was so high. Perhaps a more comparable example, actually, it's from a number of years back now. The SARS virus, which primarily hit kind of Hong Kong, China, in 2003. Probably more comparable because number one, it was a very comparable disease. So it was the first kind of novel infectious disease of the 21st century. The second one being coronavirus. But also it was in a time where social media was picking up. Facebook wasn't quite about, but MySpace was definitely out there. And you know the media was a lot more prominent than it was back in the early 1900s. And whilst there were comparatively fewer people who got infected and died from it, there are actually under 1,000 people who died from SARS in the end. The perception was still huge. So you only look at the fact that a lot of people in Hong Kong and China, they still wear face masks today, and it still affects their behaviour on a day-to-day basis. To see the impact that had on people psychologically. I believe, from everything I've read, from the research you see, people were scared at the time. They were scared that it could have been, again, a real kind of global pandemic. As luck would have it, they got on top of it fairly quickly, and the death toll was nowhere near as large as it could have been. But there are some things, and I'll go into that in terms of what that tells us about.
So Matt, just one quick point.
Yeah.
If I could please ask everybody to mute their mics, we're getting quite a lot of background noise.
Is now joining.
Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right.
Keep talking. It's all really valid.
I'm
just think a lot of people are joining, and we've been asked a question. How do you mute that? I'm not sure how you mute all the incoming and outgoing people, so you have to bear with. But I think if people could please mute their mics, that would be a real help. Sorry, Matt, you were in flow. So what you're saying is that the media has a huge part to play in our mental well-being and how we think and feel about current events.
Yeah, I think it's more about kind of looking for similarities between these macro level events that we've seen in the past, and again, one of the things that I found quite surprising when you research this sort of thing is that actually there's not a lot of research about the psychological impact that some of these events have. There's barely any from back in the early 1900s, which is perhaps understandable, but even the more recent ones, it's difficult to find. It's more focused on the death toll, the mortality rates, and this sort of thing. But we do know that these things have an impact on people psychologically as well. And the last two that we just mentioned there are even different types of psychological events. So like the 9/11 attack, a bit more coverage of that, but led to a similar response in terms of some panic, worry, anxiety, lack of control, that sort of thing. And the Zika virus was an interesting one as well. Again, kind of ongoing, although it peaked hopefully in kind of 2015-16. But the real kind of interesting bit about that was that social media was in full flow, and I've done some research around it and found that 1 in every 5 social media messages that was going out on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it was actually fake, was actually misinformed. So a fifth of everything that people were hearing wasn't true, which I think was probably, again, kind of comparable to some of the things that we're seeing now. So what I wanted to do is just start with that as a bit of the context, and we'll come back onto that, particularly SARS, around some of the things that we learned, some of the things that this tells us about how people deal with these sorts of things, but also what individuals and organizations can do to respond to that more effectively, essentially. So we'll come back and look at some of these things as we go through. Just before we do, though, I just wanted to talk fairly briefly about stress, hopefully not stressing people out on the line, but just tell you a little bit more about kind of the physiological response to stress. So some people may have come across this before, but it's always worth reminding. So essentially, we've got all these different systems within our body, and we know that our psychology and our physiology are inherently linked to one another. Okay, you feel a way, and it will impact you physically, and vice versa. And this, what you're seeing here, is something that's known as the HPA axis. Okay, so your hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. Fancy words for basically what's going on in your brain and your body in response to some sort of threat, some sort of challenging situation. And it's really interesting that what we see is that the body has these two kind of systems that exist within it physiologically, which are known as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. So when you come across some sort of threat, so when you come across something that might stress you out, or has the ability to stress you out, maybe it's an excessive demand at work or something that happens with a relationship, or in the current context, something that you hear about the coronavirus, okay? The first thing that happens is there's a bit in your brain called the amygdala that says, is that a threat? Do I need to react to that? You know, going back to evolution, is that a tiger jumping out of a bush that I need to, you know, run from potentially? So we need to act quickly. So your amygdala fires. It then passes that message on to your hypothalamus, and your hypothalamus is like the control center for your brain. It makes the decision, like I say, is this a threat or is this something that actually we can be fairly chilled out about? And it activates one of these different systems that I mentioned. So the sympathetic nervous system, that's like the accelerator pedal. Okay, it says that is a tiger jumping out of the bush and we need to do something about it, or maybe something more positive than that. So I'm about to do a presentation, and yes, this is a real challenge, but we're going to need the energy to be able to deal with that. So it gives us this burst of energy, and it does it in the form of the adrenal gland. So it literally releases adrenaline into our system, which is a real positive thing. You know, it sharpens our attention, it gets our blood pumping slightly better, sharpens our senses, gives us a way of dealing with these difficult situations. The other system that we see is the parasympathetic system, and that's almost like the brake pedal, okay, in this analogy. So it's the rest and digest. So it says, do you know what? This isn't a particular challenge. We can calm down about this. We don't need to release the adrenaline. Now, that generally works pretty well throughout the day, you know, that accelerator pedal and that brake pedal. But the problem comes when people's, when they're, as the definition says here, when stresses exceed their ability to cope, or their perceived ability to cope. And what you're then seeing is the accelerator pedal gets left on, okay? And that's where it really becomes an issue. That's when this chronic low-level stress leads to the release of cortisol. So cortisol also comes from your adrenal gland, but cortisol is really negative, okay? It has all sorts of negative effects in terms of leads to potential heart disease, links to cancer, things like anxiety and depression. If you're constantly feeling that anxious feeling, those anxious thoughts going through you. So even as a kind of a first step, being able to kind of have an understanding of this and recognizing that this is the effect that the body has, and looking out for that can be useful for some people. And it's really interesting when I was looking at the pandemic, because it's a kind of interesting analogy for stress. Okay, so in the same way that physical disease during a pandemic has its pathogens, has its triggers, has its transmission routes, it incubates in your body and then it eventually makes you sick. It's very similar with your psychology, okay? So your psychology has, rather than the physical triggers, so someone coughing on you, it has misinformation, it feeds on uncertainty, it incubates in your limbic system, okay? So that's where your emotions live, that's where the incubation happens. And worst case, it can overcome that and it can make you feel like you can't cope. And worst case, it can do that on a mass level and cause things like panic. So it's really interesting that kind of pandemic is having, or the coronavirus has this physical effect, but it also has a real effect on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And like I mentioned briefly before, you know, you've only got to look at the fact that, you know, the SARS outbreak from 2003, comparatively speaking, was so much smaller than what we're seeing now, but people still wear masks to this day. That's something psychologically that's having an impact directly on people's behavior and the reaction to it. And I don't know, Cash, have you come across the scarf factors? Have you come across those?
I have. One of the interesting points you've made there, Matt, is about actually how what we pay attention to builds this stress within us without us perhaps even realizing. And again, I was having a really good conversation with somebody yesterday about how important it is where you get your news from, how fact-based that news is. Sometimes without realizing, we might be, I don't know, getting WhatsApp and Facebook are the two channels that all of us in fact have, I would say. And it's being really mindful about what people might be circulating through those channels and how damaging that could be for your mindset, for your mentality. and
Yeah.
stress reactions?
Absolutely. So we'll talk about avoidance a little bit later on. Now, so generally speaking, avoidance is seen as a kind of a negative coping strategy. Okay, it's a, you shouldn't be avoiding these thoughts and these feelings. They're natural and they are a natural response to what's going on. But the one thing that perhaps you can avoid are some of the messages that you talked about there. So if you know that certain messages trigger a certain response in you, whether it comes from a certain media outlet or someone that then absolutely that might be the first thing that you can kind of turn down a little bit. I'll look at resilience, obviously, very briefly in just a sec, and it's all about this balance between your perceived coping mechanisms and the demands that you're facing. So you either need to increase your resources, or the other thing you can do is work directly on the demands, on the challenges. Is there something that you can do to turn that down somewhat? And that's just really quickly why I was just touching on the scarf factors. So for anyone who's not come across the scarf factors, by a guy called David Rock, they're really good. He's a social psychologist, and the scarf stands for 5 factors: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. There you go. These 5 factors, they have been shown from research that they can really trigger these threat responses in us. And again, it's just interesting. You think about 2 of them: autonomy and certainty, and you can see how what's going on at the moment could easily trigger those in people. It makes it more important, possibly, to make sure some of the others are in balance. So anyone who's interested in that scarf model, look that one up on Google. It's a good one. So we talked a little bit about the stress response and all the rest of it. I did want to throw a bit of good news in here, okay, or at least some hope, because I've been talking a lot about death and the psychological threat response to things so far. But there is some hope, okay? And that comes in the form of this complicated word here: homeostasis, or subjective well-being homeostasis, all right? So homeostasis is something that's been around for years within physiology, okay? There's loads of different things within our bodies that have this natural homeostasis. And what it basically means is that things have a kind of a natural set point. So the classic example of this is our body temperature. So our body temperature very rarely kind of moves out of a couple of degrees here or there. And if it does, that's a sign that there's not that there's something up. Either you're getting ill or there's something wrong. Okay, so your core body temperature stays around this set point. But really interestingly, a lot of research has shown that subjective well-being works in the same way. So subjective well-being, just a little bit of a detour. There's a couple of ways that you can look at it. So one way is a kind of an overall measure of your happiness. So if I was to ask you, how are you feeling generally? How satisfied are you of your life? Perhaps on a 1 to 10 basis. People can, within their minds, they can kind of put everything together and they can say, yeah, I'm about a 7, I'm about an 8, whatever it may be. There's another type of subjective well-being, which is in the moment subjective well-being. So if I'm going to ask you kind of, how are you feeling right now? How are you feeling as you sat watching this webinar? And that has a bit more fluctuation to it. Okay, so obviously the things that we're facing moment to moment has more fluctuation. But what we see is that they generally, in normal times, come back to this subjective well-being set point. So for the last few years, you can see that what this graph is showing. These are the levels within the UK that have been measured by the ONS on a huge basis since 2012, since I think it was David Cameron way back then who launched the gross national wellbeing approach. But let's see how people are feeling in terms of happiness across the country. And the levels stayed pretty similar. It's actually increased somewhat over the last few years, but over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, it stayed at about kind of 7.7 if we're looking at life satisfaction. So whilst there'll be fluctuation in there day to day and based on different people, that general level stays around there, and each individual will have a kind of a set point that's natural for them as well. Now, what's interesting about this homeostasis was that this has actually also been studied during a time of pandemic, in particular during the SARS outbreak that I talked about before. So one of the hypotheses that they had at the time, one of the theories they had at the time, was that it would have a huge impact on how people were thinking and feeling, and in particular, it would affect older people in terms of how they felt, because it was similar to the coronavirus. The mortality rate was a lot higher for those people older in age. So what they did was they measured people's subjective well-being before, during, after the crisis, and what they actually found was really interesting. that subjective well-being wasn't really affected that much. So the day-to-day emotions fluctuated, absolutely. But what we found was that life satisfaction didn't really change. So one thing is life satisfaction in the East is slightly lower than it is in the West. That is not because we think they've got less satisfaction with their lives. It's actually because they don't like using the ends of the response scale. So people in the UK are much likely to say they're a 10 or a 0, whereas people in the East are much more likely to be in the middle somewhere. But the important part is what we did see was that actually people tended to, even if they had a short-term impact on this subjective well-being, tended to bounce back quite quickly. And even there are some studies that show that it had a positive impact on people's well-being. So they found increases in things like community connectedness, future security, social cohesion, which, you think about how people are, coming outside their houses and clapping for the NHS, and you wouldn't have seen that happening 12 months ago, 18 months ago, So there are potential positives that can come out of this in terms of that community connectedness. And found a really interesting study with some stats around this. So they asked people afterwards how they're thinking and feeling, what support they're getting. And they found that a quarter of people said that they got more support from friends after the SARS outbreak than they do before. 40% said they got more support from family. 2/3 said that they paid an increased attention to their mental health, so that had become more forefront to their mind. And 36% did more exercise, which again is interesting, given the fact that, I do quite a lot of running, just generally, but I've seen a lot more people out and about. I don't know if you've seen the same thing, doing their 1 hour a day. So there's a potential positive impact here in terms of both physically and psychologically, the impact this is having. That's not to downplay it. There will be times when absolutely this will have a negative impact, and it's a lot larger in terms of the scale than we saw with SARS. So you can't take that lesson as kind of read necessarily, but it gives us a kind of a little bit of hope to strive for as well. But I think what it really tells us, which leads us on to the next bit, is that I think that people are naturally psychologically resilient. Okay, I think that most people are able to maintain their well-being within a set range. We have good days, we have bad days, but we are generally able to draw upon the resources that we've built up. All of us have built up. And when our subjective well-being, when how we're feeling drops, generally speaking, we are able to bounce back from that. But there are things that we can do to help it along the way, which is where the building resilience piece comes in, that I wanted to talk about next. Make sense?
Really useful, Matt. Thank you. Yeah.
No worries. So, what is resilience? So I can't see the chat. So I'm gonna have to take your word for it. So I was going to ask the audience if that's all right. What they think.
I think on the chat I've just thrown the scarf model. There are a couple of comments about lots of runners out there, lots of people doing various things for fitness and well-being. So the chat is definitely working. So colleagues, feel free to throw in what you think resilience is, and I can certainly bring some of that up to you, Matt, if you want.
Yeah. Well, so I can get your thoughts on it. Well, we're waiting for some thoughts there. But what do you think? What do you think resilience is? How would you describe it? What about if you thought about a resilient person that you know, either personally or in the public eye? What sort of attributes do they have that make them resilient? What would you say? This isn't a trick question, by the way. That was a question, Cash. What do you reckon?
Well, it's resilient people are. I call it the ability to almost take on a lot and bounce back and not be flustered by it. It's that bounce back ability factor. That's what I think resilience is, and just the ability to bounce back is the thing that's coming through loud and clear on the old chat. So Joe Llewellyn says resilience is the ability to navigate through difficult times. Yeah. Rachel says stand strong through uncertainty. Stephanie Anderson, overcoming difficulties, ability to come back. Simon, bounce back ability. So the ability to sort of take things on, recover from difficult times, and respond in a way that's constructive and positive, and actually, Gillian, positive mindset as well.
Have
we got the right answer? Is the question?
Completely wrong. No, I'm only messing. absolutely spot on. He's got a lot to answer for. Do you know who coined that phrase, bounce back ability? Do you know Kevin?
I'm not sure. I've heard another one that is aligned with it called rubber ballness or something.
Right,
Anyway,
right.
yeah.
So I believe that phrase was Ian Dowie, the football manager. I don't know if you know Ian Dowie.
Oh, yeah.
Terrible,
Yes, know
terrible football manager. But I like his phrase in terms of bounce back ability. Absolutely, it's inevitable. We're all going to face some sort of setback from time to time. But what really matters to a certain extent is how we respond to that. Whether we respond to that in a negative way or whether it's positive, and we're able to get ourselves through. And there's some really good things that people are mentioning around positive mindset, around the ability to adapt. Absolutely, we'd see that's core to resilience. So let me share the kind of textbook definition that I use when I talk about resilience, and it's similar to the one around stress. So I'll look at that in a sec. So it's a little bit wordy. This modifiable capacity to utilize resources and skills to flexibly adapt to challenges and advantages, enabling thriving. What the heck does that mean? The easy way to explain this is, as the picture's showing there, it's a balance. I touched on this before. We all have this balance within us between, on one side, our perceived resources. And by resources, I mean physically, psychologically, socially. What are the things we can draw upon to help us deal with, on the other side, our demands, our challenges, our threats, okay? Now, generally speaking, if your resources outweigh your demands, you're in a pretty good place. You're able to deal with the things that life is throwing at you. Problem comes is when that tips the wrong way. So either your demands increase, something happens, or your resources deplete. You don't put as much effort into building them up. And that's what leads to stress. Now, as a result of stress, what a lot of people do is they cope with that stress. And I'm glad that you didn't mention the word coping, actually, because I actually see coping as there are overlaps, but I see it as subtly different from resilience, okay? So the problem with coping is that by its very nature, it's a reactive process. You only cope with the bad times. You don't cope with how well everything's going. Whereas resilience, I do think, can be a positive thing as well as negative. But the other main thing with coping is, whilst it can be a really positive thing, which is the link to resilience, it can be a real negative thing as well. So I tell you what, Cash, give me some examples of some negative coping strategies you might use if you're stressed out. What would you use?
My go-to negative one is eating mountains of chocolate, usually.
There you go. Chocolate, yeah, that's a big one. Absolutely. Any other ideas that people might say? Any on the chat? Or
let's have a look. We've got some new messages on the chat.
Good chance for people to tell us their negative coping strategy.
Wine, gin, alcohol.
I love the specific nature of that. Specifically wine, or gin. Yeah, absolutely.
But here's an interesting one: hiding away and isolating, withdrawal from people, avoidance.
Yes, absolutely. So withdrawal, avoidance, that being, and then there's one more big one that people do. I don't know if it's come up on the chat, but that is attacking it. Work longer hours, put your bulletproof vest on, toughen yourself up, and get yourself through. Okay, so we'll see that. So when it comes to resilience and those coping mechanisms, sometimes they can be positive, but sometimes it can be really negative. Whether it's reaching for the glass of wine, or whether it's eating chocolate just to get yourself through, whether it's working as hard as you possibly can, or whether it's withdrawing. And what we want to do with resilience really is kind of avoid that as much as we can. We want to move upstream with resilience. We want to say, what can we do proactively to build our resources physically, psychologically, socially, which I'll look at shortly. And what can we do proactively, as we talked about before, to manage our demands? Is there something I can do to change the way that I'm seeing this particular challenge? And there's even research that says that, kind of positive self-talk can help with that. I talked about the adrenal response to stress before, and there's some quite compelling research that shows, that the physical response to threat and to worry and to nervousness is exactly the same as excitement. Okay, so even telling yourself, do you know what, I can deal with what I'm faced with, can help people, even from a mental and physical perspective as well. So you're thinking of it like mental fitness. You're building it up like you would do physical fitness. And I was over this. Sorry,
I've got a really quick little question for you then.
Yeah.
Is it true that you more resilient people talk to themselves in the sort of the third person to limit emotional responses to things?
I don't know. You stumped me there. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Is that something you come across? Yeah.
It's something that I heard on a podcast recently, where the way that the person reacts is almost that the more resilient people almost take themselves out of it, and they say, well, for example, in this case, you will do what Matt needs to do next. So almost you disassociate with yourself, and take the emotion out of whatever you're doing, and then work out what that so you take the personal stuff out of it and move. So it's a really interesting little story that I've heard about a couple of like elite athletes, and how, for example, in basketball, when they're stood at the hoop and it's a stressful situation, that's how they cope. So they build their resilience by stepping out of themselves and say, right, what does, I don't know, LeBron James need to do next? I think it was LeBron James's way of it. So it's worth having a look.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've heard about this, Cash, with children, where they you can imagine that they're Superman. So what would Superman do? What would your hero do to help them, motivate them to get through something? So I've heard of that too, Cash.
Perfect. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we do know, which we'll talk about, is, there's a big thing around kind of rational and irrational thoughts, and I guess that would be one way to do that. So it's very difficult to think rationally when you're in it, when you're in the thick of, just telling someone, calm down about whatever's going on that's making you really angry. That's not helpful. So maybe being able to kind of take yourself out of that and see it from a third party perspective can help you to see it more rationally rather than irrationally, perhaps. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah. So you'll have seen some of these things here, been reading through them, fact versus fate, there's loads of stuff in there. So certainly I think resilience is positive rather than negative, something that absolutely can be built, or there'd be no point in today's session. And that last one's quite important as well. One of the main misconceptions that you have around resilience, and this is one of the challenges from an organizational perspective, is it's just about squeezing more out of staff. How do we just toughen people up so that they don't get stressed out? That is not what resilience is meant to be about. It's more akin to well-being, to engagement. It's meant to be beneficial for individuals and organizations. It's not meant to be an extra thing that you do on top of your to-do list. It's meant to make the to-do list easier, essentially. So that's how we talk about resilience, a real positive thing rather than negative. So the last bit I just wanted to touch on, because time whizzes away, doesn't it? Is about improving resilience. So one quick note before we go on to some of the specific techniques is trying to improve it systemically. Okay, and what I mean by systemically is across an organisation at all levels. If systemic interventions are best, it really makes no sense to coach individuals in isolation, and you do see a lot of that. A lot of the focus is shifted onto the individual. If you just get more resilient, then you'll be able to deal with some of the pressures that you're facing. That's partly true. There isn't a responsibility from the individual to look after their health, their well-being, their mindset, whatever it may be. But I think ideally that goes alongside everything else. So you've got your, as it shows here, organizational structures and processes that are set up to get the right behaviors. You've got leaders, they play a key role. I know everything's always on the plate of the leaders and the managers, but they do play a key role in terms of role modeling the right behaviors. Empathy is key for those leaders. We talked about the scarf model before. They can't necessarily take away some of the uncertainty and some of the lack of control, but they can make sure that things are relatively fair, and they can make sure that the status and the relatedness are looked after. So it makes those factors even more important, and understanding that people are in this quite psychologically charged state a lot of the time. So even small kind of things that they say or things that they do, or the way that they interact with their team, can have a bigger impact than we'd usually see. And there's even a big thing around effective teams, looking for high levels of psychological safety and how you're communicating across whole organizations and across teams, even to the extent where you're keeping people informed, but also making it clear that the experience of this stress that they may be feeling now, whether it's from the coronavirus directly or whether it's from the impact that might have on their job security or anything like that, it's understandable. It's totally understandable. It means that they're human beings, and it's a universally experienced response to a pandemic like this, and the uncertainty that goes alongside it. So what we're looking for is for organizations to kind of identify some of those stresses, articulate them constantly across the organization, and almost kind of normalize them. So the last thing you want to do is create stigma around some of this stuff. Again, we've seen pandemics in the past where the kind of the illness itself has been really stigmatized. Think about HIV and AIDS, for example. Real stigma across that affected whole populations as a result of that, and that's the last thing that we want to happen with coronavirus, particularly within specific organizations.
One of the
There's
things,
one.
Matt, that
Yeah,
one
go.
of the things that we've seen and used at Northwest Employers is reminding people that actually you're working from home through a crisis. You're homeschooling through a crisis.
Mm.
At the end of the day, it is a crisis, and we wouldn't be normally doing what we're doing right now. And that, again, that's a way of helping colleagues cope with what's happening and how they might be feeling, and it almost gives them permission to be almost vulnerable and ask for support. So there is the language around how we present some of like certainly the work condition stuff that you're talking about. It's actually this is abnormal, and it's okay to feel rubbish, or if you want to talk, please do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Even on a slightly kind of lighter note, but I guess still relevant. The thing that he said when I logged in. So when I logged in, for those who weren't here, I said apologies if my two kids run screaming in the background, which hasn't happened yet. I put a box in front of the door, so I might keep them out. But there was once people might have got stressed out about that, but it's just a reality nowadays, isn't it? It's just it's unavoidable to a certain extent that might happen. So you don't want that sort of thing that wouldn't usually be normal, kind of causing excess anxiety or stress for somebody as well. So yeah, it is interesting. It's interesting how things have changed. What will be really interesting is how much of this sustains afterwards. And I don't know the answer to that. So the challenge would be, some of the positive things we talked about before. People are exercising slightly more. Maybe they're focusing on their values slightly more. How do we get that to stick, but make sure some of the other stuff doesn't, essentially? And there's kind of good science from the research that is possible, as I mentioned, but it's how individuals and organisations are managing that. So just final slide, just for the final 5 minutes, I just wanted to touch on some of the ways that people can build personal resilience. And basically, there's tons of ways. There's all sorts of different things, some of which we've already mentioned. I kind of break them down. This is a model that I use. I break them down into these 3 areas of mental strength, flexibility, endurance. The reason I do that is because I like people to think of resilience like mental fitness. So these are things that you can practically do to build up your resilience in the good times. So in the bad times when you need it, it's there. So starting on the left-hand side, you'll come across some of these things. So I mentioned avoidance before. So this generally comes down to identifying the negative coping strategies that people have, and trying not to fall into those traps, trying to develop more positive coping strategies rather than negative ones. When the feeling that you need to eat that whole bag of chocolate comes into your mind, what's your alternative to that? Is it going for a run? Is it doing something physically, perhaps? At the same time, if you want to eat some chocolate cash, that's absolutely fine as well.
Thanks, Matt.
But you know what I mean. Where worst case scenario, people get drawn into these very negative coping strategies, and that's all that they can see. So it's trying to stay clear of that if you possibly can. Focus on strengths is a big one. Very easy during these sorts of times. I mean, outside of these times, I ask people about strengths, and generally they go blank. Because we focus so much of our adult lives on the things we're not good at, the things we need to work on, I hate these words, development needs. Not nearly enough time on the things we are good at and our strengths and how we make the most of those. But it becomes particularly important during a time like now. Gratitude, again, obviously a big one in terms of that positive psychology that comes alongside that. There's some interesting ones in mental flexibility, which again, I'm sure people will have come across. So things like control the controllables, all the lessons that we can learn from things like cognitive behavioral therapy. And I don't think that people necessarily needs to be viewed as a therapy session when we're talking about some of these things. But it's, how do I just get in a habit of catching some of the more negative thoughts, learning to reframe them to more positive. Journaling is a real powerful tool. Writing them down, right? If you're worrying in the middle of the night because you can't stop your mind worrying and it's stopping you sleeping, one of the best things you can do, just get up and write those things down, because they're on a piece of paper, they're parked. And then plus, in the morning, it's a lot easier to challenge the ramblings of a mad person that you saw at 2 a.m. in the night when all those things are whizzing through your head. So that'd be a big one.
Just a couple of comments on certainly the mental strength and the flexibility. A couple, certainly myself, and just notice on the chat there, Sharon, we keep like a gratitude journal. Mm-hmm. And I do mine on my phone, which is like it's an app basically. It's called Diary, and you can take photos, and it tells you what you were doing this time last year, and it kind of keeps you keeps you grounded, and there is something about the practice of doing that and turning that into a habit. And then just on the mental strength, I don't know if folks have heard of the Calm app, which I'm showing on the screen there. And again, this is something obviously you have to buy. It's a bit like the Headspace app. And there are other apps that are available. So it's almost, you can use technology to really help or create the habit. And going back to what you were saying there, Matt, about how much of this is going to stick, I think there is something really, I'm curious about this as time goes on, because habits take something along the lines of 40 odd days to start becoming habits, don't they? So if you start walking,
yeah. Sorry, yeah, go
on. And it's almost if like an unhelpful habit, which is, you know, at 9 o'clock you raid the cookie cupboard and off you go eating chocolate, versus you hack that habit and go for a walk instead. So it's almost there is an opportunity right now for us to adopt more constructive well-being habits as a whole, versus but then to get there, that takes a bit of self-knowledge, a bit of support from others.
Yeah. To be perfectly honest, I could have run the whole session on habits. You could run a whole. Honestly, you could run the whole thing on it. Habits are incredibly important. You know, some of this stuff, you'll look at this slide and you go, yeah, I know that, but I'm not going to do it. You know, I can't get it to stick, perhaps, and that's where habits become important. You know,
so how does it work, Matt? How can we get some of this to stick for ourselves?
So there's tons of ways. One of the things I would say at the moment is that there's an increased opportunity to do that, okay? Because the way that habits work is they're a three-part model: cue, behavior, and reward. So the trigger or the cue, that makes you think, I want to. So it hits 9 o'clock, I want to eat that cookie. The behavior is, I'm going to eat it, and the reward is, I feel good because I've eaten it, or perhaps not good. But what that does is it reinforces over time and becomes automatic. Yeah. And one of the opportunities that we have at the moment is your workplace, for example, where you go to work and you set yourself up at your desk and all the rest of it. That is littered with things that create automatic habits. Okay, even your morning routine is an automatic habit. You know, from you getting up in the morning and showering and getting dressed and driving, doing the commute to work, and then getting to your desk and opening your emails. It's all habits, all of it. So what this is doing for people who are working differently is disrupting those habits. It's disrupting those cues. So you do have an opportunity to say, right, what are my new cues at this point? You know, if I've not got the commute, what am I going to do with that? What am I going to do with that time? What are the automatic things that I can put in place? So yeah, so it'd be making the cues for the things that you want to do as visible as you possibly can. Okay, so for example, if you want to, let's put it simple, if you want to drink more water, set yourself an alarm that goes off every hour. Drink water, drink water, drink water, drink water. I know it sounds over the top, but without that cue, if you don't have that, you get to 3 in the afternoon, you've not drunk any water. You need to make the behavior as easy as possible. So you're going to get a big bottle of water and you're going to stick it on your desk or wherever you're working, because if the alarm goes off, drink water, but you're in the middle of something and the kids are screaming outside and you think, oh, I'll do the next one. I'll do the next one. It gets to 3 p.m. You've not drunk any water. So the behavior needs to be as easy as you possibly can. Start small. You know, if you want to start exercising, do not sign yourself up for a marathon. Well, you can't at the moment, but don't do that. You know, go for like 10 minutes walk every day and then build it up from there. Start so small that you can't not start, and reward yourself as well. That's the final bit. I've even come across people who set up savings accounts and they put like £1 in every single time that they adhere to a habit. There's other ways. I use something called a paperclip technique, where you get 2 pots. One's empty and the other's full of paper clips. Right. And every time you do something that you want to do, whatever habit that may be, I'm going to drink water, I'm going to go for a walk, I'm going to take a quick break, you move a paperclip from one to the empty pot. And all you're doing is you're rewarding yourself. You're seeing visibly, I have achieved something, you know, as you've got those paper clips rattling around. Plus, it's the reminder, it's another cue, because if at 3 p.m. there's no paper clips in the empty pot, you know you've not done something right. So it kind of cues you into it. So yeah, like I could go on forever about habits. There's loads around habits, but certainly, yeah, even if there's a couple of small positives that people can get from this, how do they get them to stick as a result? Can I sneak one more in just before we finish?
Of course.
Is that all right? Yeah. Just about the values, and just something really interesting that I came across. So values are always important, reflecting on what really matters to us. But I found some really interesting research and really interesting study around something called socio-emotional theory. So again, kind of a wordy theory that you see in there. But what it basically is the different types of values that people focus on. And what we find is that when people are reminded of the finality, I know it sounds a bit morbid, but the finality and the fragility of life during something like a pandemic, they actually shift their values. The values go away from these kind of future-orientated goal values towards emotionally meaningful ones. And they have evidence for this, looking at people of different age. So what they've done was studies where they ask people, if you had 30 minutes, you got 30 minutes to spend with one or two people. You can either spend it with a family member, close family member who you know well, or you can spend it with an author of a book that you've read recently. Now, in general times, take the pandemic out of it, what they found was that older people would choose to spend the time with the close family member. So older people were saying about over 75 there. Younger people chose to spend it with the author. And the reason they think that is, the mechanism behind it, is because older people, comparatively speaking, have less time left. So they want to spend it on things that really mean something to them emotionally. Whereas younger people, I've got all the time in the world to spend with my family. I could learn something now. I can learn something new for a future goal. But what the really interesting part is that they looked at this relationship and how it changed during and after 9/11, and again after the SARS virus. And what they found was that difference between the age group disappeared for about 3 or 4 months after the virus and after 9/11. So whilst that was going on, everybody was saying, what really matters to me? What are my emotionally important values, rather than what do I want to achieve and what's the future and all the rest of it. So I just found it really interesting. There's been a lot out there at the moment about, you should use this time to set yourself a challenge or a goal or learn a new language or, whatever it may be. And absolutely, if that's something that you want to use for yourself to kind of pass the time and all the rest of it. But some people will find that, well, I was just going to say, some people will find that their bandwidth is only enough to focus on the things that are right in front of them right now. And if that's the things that are really emotionally important to you, I'd say make the most of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and just there was a guy yesterday on the BBC News, because I've given myself one opportunity to watch the news all day, and that's it.
Yeah.
And he was in the recovery. It was in the recovery phase. Coronavirus, and
is now exiting.
Essentially what you've just said, Matt, which is, before I got this, I was running around everywhere. I was too busy. I was chasing, the money. I was trying to run my business, and now all I want to do is see my family. That's all I want to do. Yeah, and it's almost that's changed him.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Dead interesting. Like I say, it's a bit of a morbid fascination, because as a psychologist, I'm incredibly interested by what's going on and how it affects people psychologically. But I think that the education and understanding is key, and if it can help us even a small part to get through some of this, then it's got to be helpful, hasn't it?
So I think in terms of the time, we've got time for a couple of questions, but I'll just give people a chance to think about this. But in terms of this webinar, the purpose of it was to get the topic of resilience out there, get it discussed, and the slide that's currently on there is talking about actually that there is further support that we're looking at. So I know, Stephanie, you've mentioned a session on this topic. Sharing some activities we can do, we can absolutely look into that. But Matt also does quite a lot of work through a resilience and wellbeing app, and there's this lifestyle assessment tool that Matt uses. I've actually used it myself. It talks about, it helps you work out when you're actually recovering, when you're actually active. It helps you measure your own stress level. So really, really useful, but it's very, very personal. So it's not going to work for everyone, but certainly have a chat with us if that is something that would be of interest to you. But in terms of future webinars, if you've enjoyed the resilience webinar today, please tell us, because actually, we can't do this without your feedback. And actually, if there are any other areas that you think we should be looking into, then please tell us that as well, because as I said before, Matt and I and Pat and the team, we're trying to do our best to support everybody. And actually, if you found the conversation useful as a part of support to you individually, then that's brilliant. But please share that with us. And then just to sort of share, we have got another webinar next week with one of our other associates, looking at how do you manage virtual teams, and a topic that's very close to my heart, which is how do you homeschool throughout all this. And I think some of the answers are, you know, do your best. You know, you are homeschooling through a crisis, but actually we're hoping that Eva will be able to give us some further insights into how parents can maintain a level of sanity and get some work done. So I don't know if there's any questions. I'm seeing a lot of comments now on the right hand side of my screen. I don't know if Pat, is there anything that you've spotted that we can ask Matt, or any sort of further discussion we can hold for the next couple of minutes? And then
well, we've had lots of comments about how brilliant the session is, Matt, and how people have picked up tips, and but they'd like more sessions on things like sleeping better, more on habits, mental health, for first aiders. So yeah, mental health first aiders again from somebody else.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I tell you what, the mental
lots of food for thought there, Matt, for other sessions.
Yeah. The mental health first aid, absolutely. So it's not something that I do personally, but certainly I think that would fit really kind of closely, really nicely with what's going on at the moment. I said about, you know, identifying and articulating and normalizing some of the things that people are feeling and some of the stress reactions that people may have, and that's exactly what you'd find with mental health first aiders. You know, people are going to be feeling differently, and if it's in that moment that you catch them and you have a positive conversation, then that'll be crucial, I think. So yeah,
also, don't forget we've done some insight pieces on well-being. Don't forget that you can access those, you can read those, and in there there's quite a number of links to different things that we're able to connect to. But I think yeah, definitely picking up the point on mental health first aid. There's a question about how do you sleep better. There's a question about session about employees who feel isolated. So yeah, there's quite a bit there for us to think about. Any specific questions then? Is there anything that anyone wants to ask? We've got like a couple of minutes. So there's a question there on how do you build, hang on. These notifications are just appearing on the left, so I can't really see them. Right, so how do you build resilience resources? There's a lot there, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, like I say, it's the breaking it down to physically, psychologically, and socially, and having a plan around it, and dealing with it like you would do physical fitness. You know, unfortunately, one of the things I didn't mention about resilience, psychological resilience, is that you do actually need to put some work into it. So in the same way that with physical exercise, you can't just think yourself fit and healthy. It's the same psychologically. You know, you need to actually work on it. So whether that is, you know, gratitude journaling or having more conversations about your thoughts and feelings. Again, that was one of the studies I found, was that people had significantly more conversations about their thoughts and their feelings after the SARS event than before. So even something like this, you know, what are the benefits that I can get out from this from a psychological perspective, whether it's opening up and talking more, particularly for men as well, because men are bad at that. And even in the SARS outbreak, they were still significantly less than women in terms of talking about some of their emotions. But yeah, so but just having a plan for yourself, you know, so not something that's going to be too strict, but you know, what are the, like I said, with the habits, what are the kind of the 5 or 6 things I'm going to do every day? How am I going to track them in the same way that I'm going to make sure I get some fresh air? I'm going to make sure I go outside, I can do some exercise. What are the mental things that you can do?
Harrison.
So it's always just kind of
exiting.
It's always topping it up. It's always topping it up, I guess, and social as well. Just because you're socially isolating doesn't mean that you need to lose that connectedness, you know. So again, anecdotally, another thing I've heard is that people are talking to friends and family more than they ever have at the moment. So it kind of puts into sharp realization, doesn't it? You took them for granted at the time when you could have gone and saw them, but now you can't. You're desperate to get on Teams with them and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's just breaking it down in those 3 areas and seeing them all as, how do I build that constantly up over time, but also how do I impact on some of the demands as well. And then the final thing is, it's inevitable. You know, there's a famous quote by Mike Tyson, that you all have heard of that says everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Okay, so you'll do all the good things in the world, you'll build up your resources, you'll work on your demands, and life will still knock you for six. Something will still set you back. But then it's about, what can I draw upon? What have I done in the good times to help me to bounce back from that effectively? And again,
and just to close, Matt, that's where where when you do get punched in the mouth, that's when you do need to bounce back. That's where your resilience is. That's where it counts, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So just want to say a huge thanks, Matt, to you and for your time and for your energy and enthusiasm in pulling something together for us. I just want to say a huge thanks to everybody that was on the webinar. I think we had 50 odd people on the webinar today, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for engaging with us, and certainly look forward to doing more of these. So we've picked up the comments that are in the chat, so we will definitely have a look at those. And don't forget, we've got the webinar next week. We've got the resources available through the Northwest Employers website and resources pages. And if there is anything else that you guys need, please let us know, get in touch. We're here for you. And with that, I will close the webinar.